Good evening and welcome to our Zoom session this evening. I'm so happy to introduce Sejal Keshwala, who has just finished playing Ray in Everybody's Talking About Jamie. And we're going to be this evening hopefully talking through some aspects of representation in musical theatre in terms of South Asian representation. But it's very exciting to be talking to you, Sejal. I'm really happy that you're here.
Thank you for having me.
What was that, sorry?
I said thank you for having me.
Sorry. I wonder if you might be able to just say a little bit about the sorts of work that you've been doing and some of the roles that you've played over the last few years.
Yeah, kind of my first big job was Bend It Like Beckham the musical, which was about 6 years ago now, and that was my first kind of musical theatre job. I'd actually graduated from drama school 4 years prior to that, so it took me quite a while to land that first part. And kind of in between Bend It Like Beckham and Jamie, which are kind of the big two commercial shows I've done, I've been quite lucky in that I've done a variety of work. I've done some really lovely plays. I did Anita and Me, which I don't know if you know the book or the movie, but I was a big fan of that growing up. It was the book is written by Mira Sejal. She's also in the film. So I did the UK tour of that, and I was in a few plays at the Finborough Theatre and little bits and bobs like that. And I also do a lot of singing as well. Do a lot of concert work and session work to kind of get by, and I'm trying to get into do more TV work. So yeah, I like a variety. So I feel like I've been lucky to have done smaller scale, bigger scale plays, musicals, and I hope I can continue doing so.
Absolutely. I mean, it's lovely to see. We're really happy to see that you work with the Birmingham Rep as well, and
yes,
and because that's especially at that time, that was such a lovely place to be able to explore different stories. I know that's one of the things they've been trying really hard, is to make sure that their storytelling matches their audience, and I think that's something, I suppose, when we're looking at this module, that's something that's really important to us, is thinking about how we build an audience for people that don't necessarily always come to the theatre.
No, and that's why regional theatre is so important, especially when you have really great producing houses like Birmingham Rep. You know, with Anita and Me, the production had been put on there before and had toured before. So that's kind of where I went and rehearsed. But we actually opened in Wolverhampton, and, you know, the play is set in the Black Country. So actually, that was my favourite venue that we did, because it was an audience who understood the language and the humour, and it was very familiar. Whereas actually some of the other UK towns we went to were still wonderful, but, you know, the language wasn't quite as familiar, so it didn't land as well. That's why I think regional theatre is really important, because, like you said, it makes theatre more accessible for people who wouldn't always go, people who can't afford to go, especially, you know, coming down to London, seeing shows in London is very expensive. So if things can be made accessible for people within their communities, I think that's really important.
And Anita and Me is such a beautiful place to start as well, because it's I guess it's a story that's become quite well known, like you say, through the book and through the film as well. And I was wondering about how you found the transition from it being sort of so well known as a book and a film, and then taking it to be a theatre piece, a piece in the play.
Do you know what? I think it worked quite well, and that's probably down to the writing with someone like Mira, because she does, you know, she's an actress.
Yes.
And I think the transition from novel to film worked well. So in that sense, I think transitioning it to theatre, it didn't need a million edits. It actually really worked well in all mediums.
Yes, I think it's lovely when that when that happens, when you've got a story which kind of feels like it moves across different spaces, and different ways of telling as well. And I suppose one of the other things that I was interested in is you mentioned that Anita and Me was one of your favorites, or what was a story that you loved from growing up. What other stories did you really enjoy when you as you were kind of growing up? What sort of stories were your favorites?
Well, you know, obviously Bend It Like Beckham was a huge film for my culture and my generation. I so distinctly remember it's one of the only films that we went to see at the cinema as a family, something we all wanted to see. And it was just this little indie film that had huge success. And I think it was also one, you know, you had your films, you know, East is East, which I also loved, but a lot of your East is East and your Anita and Me's was set more in my parents' generation. Whereas for me, Bend It Like Beckham was my youth. And so, yeah, and even Gurinder Chadha, who directed it and wrote it, one of her previous films I remember watching as a child called Bhaji on the Beach. I don't know if you've heard of it or if you've seen it. It's really worth watching as well. So yeah, I think a lot of Gurinder's work actually. But actually, when I was younger, when I was as in like a child, it was Bollywood movies that I was really into. And as I got older, I started watching them less because I lost the language a bit. And so for then it did become kind of TV and more kind of your American and British musicals. And you know, I then joined an Amdram Society in the Midlands, and that was kind of my way in. But I kind of I've always enjoyed musical theatre because it incorporates all the things I like. I like acting and I like good acting. I like singing and I like good singing. And I like those things separately, but actually when those things are done well together.
Yeah, and it's something that definitely comes across, I think, in musical theatre. For most of us is I guess is one of the reasons why we love it, but all of us approach it, of course, from very different backgrounds as well. I'm just going to mention, I know some people have already started to put questions in, but if you would like to ask any questions, please do put them in the Q&A box. And we'll take a look at them as we go through, and I'll kind of feed those through as we're talking. And it would be lovely to have some of your questions and not just my face talking for the whole time. So yeah, do put your questions in the Q&A box. And just to remind everyone, I'm sure you know this, but this is being recorded tonight, so just make sure you don't put any personal information into the Q&A box or the chat. Thank you for that. Yes, so you mentioned Bollywood there a little bit, and one of the things that I've always felt a little bit surprised about, and I've spoken to some of our students that are into Bollywood before about this, but why it is that when Bollywood is this huge industry and so popular, why it hasn't translated more into the theatre, or it hasn't, at least, I guess, not necessarily into the theatre, because I know it has, but into the commercial theatre. Because I can think of Bombay Dreams, which was about 20 years ago, but I can't think of many other times that Bollywood has kind of has been allowed into the musical theatre.
Yeah, it's an interesting one, because even though, you know, the film industry in India is humongous, they churn out more films than Hollywood does, but actually, even in the sense that there isn't really much of a crossover with Bollywood and Hollywood, so almost, you know, getting a crossover into theatre is an even harder thing. And I think maybe that's, you know, they do have theatres in India, I believe, but I think just the whole culture of going to the theatre isn't as big as a thing. You know, it's cinema. India is about cinema, and maybe that's accessibility because, you know, of money. There isn't as much. There's a big live music scene. There isn't as big of a live theatre scene. So maybe in that sense, it's also not pushed from that side for these things to be made. And I think also ultimately, I think it comes down to writing. You know, when we talk about representation and diversity and all these stories, that there are so many people to represent, so many stories to be told. Ultimately, that begins with writing. And I think unless there are people of that culture here who want to tell those stories and then can get investment and then get producers, it's not going to happen. So I think it's because there's not enough encouragement and money put into writing.
Yes, yeah, and I think that's again, that's one of the things. I suppose places like Birmingham Rep are starting to support the idea, and with their very small studio theatre that they have, they've started to put on a more diverse range of work. And it's also down to those of us that are not part of the Indian culture or Black culture or whatever it might be, to support that work as well, because I think sometimes we have a feeling, we go, oh well, that's not for me, that's definitely for other people. And actually that's not, that the whole purpose of storytelling is that we can learn about all sorts of different places and characters and that sort of thing. I was wondering, are there any kind of roles that you really, or stories that you would really like to be able to tell, whether it's in theatre or in film, or is there anything that you're really interested in kind of portraying?
Rather than specific stories, I think it's just the type of roles. I think the one really good thing about everybody's talking about Jamie, I thought, was that certainly when I joined, there were 2 Indian actresses in the cast. There was me playing the character of Ray, and I joined with a beautiful actress called Sabrina Sandhu, who was Priti Pasha. And it's what you've got in this musical. You've got a character like Priti, who is written, and it is relevant to the story for her to be of a certain background. You cannot have somebody not of that background playing that part.
Yeah.
And for this story, that is really important. In the same space, you've got me playing Ray. Now, from the history of the show, they have always cast that part Indian.
Yes.
However, it's not actually relevant to the story what her race is or her ethnicity. And so my understudies were all of different ethnic backgrounds to me. And I think that is also important, that I am there to tell this character's story, but that is actually nothing to do with how I look. Yes. I was also 20 years younger than the people who played it before me, which I also think was really great. They weren't just getting a carbon copy. So for me, it's the balance of, yes, there are stories of our history that are really important to be told, but in that same breath, I also just want to play an average woman in her late 20s, early 30s in Britain. I also just want to play those characters and tell that story, because that is my story. Yes. Yes. I think it's finding the balance of both. Like, we don't only need to do period pieces about the partition. Yes. Or about Bollywood, or the things that people connect with that culture. Yes, absolutely. And I think that's one of the things, I mean, everyone that I know has seen the musical, everybody's talking about Jamie, is, loves it for all sorts of different reasons. And I suppose, as somebody who used to be a secondary school teacher, I just love the fact that it's a classroom which actually looks like a classroom that we might have taught in. In terms of the students within that classroom. Okay, it's quite a small class, but but the students within it, there's such a range of ethnicities there, a range of all sorts of things as well. And having spoken to some of the actors that are part of that, it's so lovely to hear about the different backgrounds that people have. And actually, I suppose you were playing the same age as a lot of those actors actually are in real life as well, which is kind of another layer on top of it. Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's props to our director, Jonathan Buttrell, who came up with the concept of the show, because he watched this documentary about this boy called Jamie, and because it comes, he set the show in Sheffield, where he is from. So for him, it's a story with heart, and it's something very personal to him. And so what he has done is created a world in this musical that reflected the world that he grew up in. He grew up in this area in Sheffield, and this is what it looked like. And that's why it's important to have people of all backgrounds and all ages on creative teams and on production teams, because only that way can you get variety in different stories being told. Yes, absolutely. And I again, from what I know from talking to other people with the rehearsal process as well, I know that they were very keen when there were cast changes not to necessarily replicate the same
relationships between characters, even within the ensemble. There might have been different ways that people responded to different characters.
Yeah, and that's actually, for long running shows, that's rare. If you're going into your Les Mis and your Wickeds, it's a different skill and it's a different experience. There is a certain way to sing the song. There is a certain way to deliver the line. This is where you stand. The blocking is set. There's no creative input in that sense. Whereas with Jamie, that was the wonderful thing about it, especially when you're coming from an acting standpoint of, yes, there are certain things that can't be changed because the set and the lighting are what they are.
Yeah.
But in terms of a rehearsal process, it's not just, this is where you stand, this is how you say it. It's working together to build relationships and build characters. And if you have an offering that doesn't work for you, then we can discuss it and find something else. So yeah, they are very good at that. And in that sense, they're not doing carbon copies when they're doing recasts. Like I said, I'm 20 years younger than the people who have played the part before me, which if I was going up for other musicals, that would never happen.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And of course you were following Mina Snow. You were following
Shobna.
Shobna Gulati, and I was trying to think of, is it Mina Anwar?
And Mina Anwar, who originated,
who originated the role. I guess both of whom may have been the most well-known person to the audience in the show, actually, thinking about the cast originally, for people who were coming from a background of television or film.
Yes, yeah.
And I guess that must have been an interesting thing as well, in terms of how the dynamics of the cast work and who you were working with and all of that sort of thing as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's I do find, I mean, I'm as my students know, I'm a little bit obsessed with everybody's talking about Jamie, because that's currently the sort of thing that I'm writing about, in terms of LGBTQ representation in musical theatre. But it's one of the things I love is the fact that there's so many different ways to look at that musical as well. And we have got a couple of questions about everybody's talking about Jamie, so I'll come to those now, if that's okay. So this is from Emily. She says, in everybody's talking about Jamie, what was your favourite line in the musical? And it's one of the favourite musicals that Emily has seen so far. Hurrah!
Do you know what? It's really hard to tell you what a favourite line is, because when I watched the show before I was in it, there were things that I loved. And then when you're in the show, because you start getting in jokes within the cast, things that aren't even funny become funny. I don't know if I could pick just one. I'm quite lucky in that I had a lot of good one-liners. God, I only finished the show a month ago. I should remember all the lines, you'd think. Do you know what? I'll come back to that, what a favourite line is. Yes. It will come to me during this Q&A.
Yeah. I always loved the line that you had to Pretty when you see her in her all dressed up for the...
Yeah.
Because it's I don't know... Could you tell us a little bit about what the origin of that line is? I don't know what language it is, but it's the first time that we hear Ray talk.
Yes, when I say Gibha.
Yeah.
Which is Punjabi. And then I say to her, Mashallah, because she's of Pakistani origin. So it's that thing of, but we're both South Asian. Yes. So it's that thing of, I'm kind of greeting you with, or how I would say, you look amazing, or wow, and then kind of saying it in her way as well.
Yeah. Oh, I didn't even realize that. But that's just like a really lovely layer that perhaps you would only recognize if it was something that was in your own experience.
Yes.
But so important, I think.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Yes, we'll come back to that. We'll come back to that question. I'll leave it up there and we'll come back to it a little bit later. This is a question from Chris. You mentioned that you love Ray wasn't put in a box with regards to race and age, and you got to tell the story of a woman instead of being put in the box of Asian woman. Do you? Have you found it difficult to get cast in roles where your race hasn't forced you into a box?
Generally speaking, yes. because Jamie's probably me moving slightly into the next box. Before Jamie, I would say I've only been cast in parts in plays and musicals because I'm Indian, because they are Indian parts. With Jamie, definitely part of the reason that I was in the room is because I'm Indian. So even though it's not mentioned in the script, I know that Jonathan likes to have that part cast as an Asian woman. I don't know whether that's because it's based on somebody he knows or that's just what he likes from his experience. So yes, I also got that role partly because of that. However, it's not completely relevant to the story. Like I said, my understudies aren't. So for me, the next, I think certainly musical theatre, particularly, it has, and you know, if you look at how many South Asian people have been in most of these long running shows in town, most of them none. So in that sense, it is definitely harder to, I find it harder to get seen for or to get roles where that isn't at the forefront of the character, and that is something that needs to change.
Yeah, absolutely. I remember there was I'm so sad I missed it because I was not at my computer at the right time, but there was a streamed concert recently. Was it Benjamin Armstrong?
Oh, yes.
Which was completely, I think it was completely South Asian.
Yeah, I believe so.
And to me, it's a starting point. I mean, again, it is sort of like here's a big box of this, but it was people being able to sing whatever they choose, and I know that that's the way that a lot of things have started with in other places as well.
It's very, very, very slowly starting to get a bit better, but I'm talking very slowly. You know, in the 10 years since I graduated, 11 years now, I only had my first ever audition for Les Mis this year for Fontaine. And I was like, you know, why have I not been able to get in the door for this part before? If you look at a show like Wicked, where it is based on fictional characters, they still like a certain look, a certain height, a certain weight for certain characters, which doesn't make sense because it's fictional.
Yes.
You know, if she's green, it doesn't really matter what size she is or what ethnicity she is.
Yes.
And also for Glinda, why should it matter so long as she's wearing a blonde wig and that she's funny and can sing the lines? So yeah, it's definitely a harder, but I think things will start to change, probably slower than we want, but there's no casting directors don't really have an excuse anymore. So the first step is getting in the door. And I think for me, certainly now, I am finding certainly this year, past year and a half, I've been getting into rooms that I've never gotten into before. Whether I'm actually being considered for the job, I don't know yet. That's the next hurdle. But yeah, it's starting to be a conversation.
And of course, these are all hurdles that you might not necessarily, that a lot of people, particularly from a white background, don't have the same sort of difficulties getting through these hurdles. It's almost like they're starting halfway down the race. And I think I would encourage, I mean, our students here and people who are looking at the people who are in the room here, if you're going on to be teachers or producers or in whatever level you're casting, I think this is a really important thing for us to consider, particularly if we're not people that have faced the hurdles ourselves as we've gone through things. So thank you so much for that, Sejal. That's really, really helpful and important. Okay, let's go back and see another one on Jamie. we'll get on to Bend It Like Beckham in a bit because I think that's also an important one to talk about. But it says, I saw Jamie on tour in Birmingham and loved how little parts of the show were adapted to acknowledge COVID, and it was done in a fun and tasteful way. Were similar changes made to the West End version, and how did that process happen? I suppose the idea of something being rewritten in the middle of a run is quite unusual, isn't it?
No, it is. And yeah, we did also have COVID references in the West End, especially because West End opened before the tour did. So actually we had a few more, but actually since we opened, the rules have changed. So they've probably actually taken some of them out for the tour. I think it was there was a bit of back and forth on some of it, but essentially I was like, it's set in modern day, it's set in a school, it almost seemed silly for it not to be. But in the same sense, there was stuff added in which then got taken out, because you also don't want it to override everything else and be too much. So yeah, we did add it in, and I think it was relevant at the time. And certainly for me, actually one of my favorite lines was a COVID line that was added, which was in Act 2, just before my limited edition song. I do a scene. It's me and Margaret Mum before Jamie walks in, and we're talking about being at Legs 11 the night before, and I'm kind of talking about going home with someone. And I can't remember the line, but I said something about, oh, don't worry, we wore protection, we kept our masks on the whole time. So for me, the COVID references were jovial. So yeah, and again, that would, I don't think that would happen in most of the shows, but especially long running shows, because they're very set. But with Jamie, it's like a play with songs, and it is about realism, the show. So I don't think there was any harm in them adding that in, and that was all down to the writers. The writers, when we came back, had the new script, and we trialed stuff, and stuff was taken out and added in, but yeah, that was all down to them.
And the other thing that's just occurred to me that I wanted to mention is the way that resident directors and resident choreographers are used in Jamie, because I think it's one of the first shows that I've seen that nearly, not always, but nearly always, the resident director either comes from somebody that's been in the ensemble previously, or is somebody that is understudying your role or one of the other roles in it. And I wonder if there's anything that kind of particular that comes out of that sort of dynamic, because I know, I'm trying to think who was the last resident director.
Ebony.
Yes, and before that also there was somebody.
Before that there was Shiv.
That's it, Shiv. Yeah. And so how kind of all these different people coming through as resident directors, and I know Marvin Charles did some work in terms of resident choreography, and it's all sorts, again, different people from all sorts of different backgrounds. And I wonder how that kind of works in practice, particularly for people who maybe are not familiar with what those roles do.
Yeah, I'm sure it's, for those people, it's very stressful, especially if they're still involved in performing in the show. But in many ways it can work well, because they know the show like the back of their hand. So in terms of, especially in a small cast like us, and post-COVID, excuse me, we came back with the smaller cast. So we had less understudies, less covers, which meant it was quite often we are doing a cut show. So with their brains, they know the cuts to make, and they know the scene transitions. And so having somebody who is doing it day in and day out, then take charge of that, is really helpful. The one thing that I think can be sometimes a bit difficult with it is, for me, you already have a dance captain, so you have somebody who knows the physical movement of the show. So in that sense, having a resident that is slightly more from an acting background, I think can be really beneficial, especially in a show like Jamie. So you've got somebody with the choreography and the blocking cap on, and then you've got somebody with the acting cap on.
Yes.
But I completely get, from a producer's point of view, why it can make sense financially to have somebody in the building who can do all of the things.
Yeah, because I mean, it was quite a big risk, wasn't it, financially, to bring Jamie back? Because I think it came back for a week or something, didn't it?
We did 4 shows at Christmas.
Yeah. And that must have been quite a risk for the producers, I guess, as well. And for all of you as well, who were kind of going into this new sort of way of performing without knowing, and rehearsing without necessarily knowing how it worked. But it's lovely that there's such a tight-knit company with Jamie. And I know that this is another thing that I've never seen happen ever anywhere else, where people from the West End cast are covering for the tour, and people from the tour came and covered in the West End as well.
Yes, and do you know what else they're very good at, which also doesn't happen very often, is they've been very loyal to certain actors. When I joined, the person who was playing Margaret used to be the standby or the understudy, and then she got bumped up. And then when she left, Mel, who was the standby and the understudy, she then got bumped up. And it's given that opportunity to progress.
Yes.
And for someone like Mel Jakes, she's wonderful, and she was in the original cast of Mamma Mia. She's been in the industry for 25 years, and this was her first time actually playing the lead role and not being an understudy. And what can happen a lot in this industry is certain casting directors, certain producers, once you do one thing, it's hard for them to see you in a new bracket. So if you have understudied a lot, or if you do swing a lot on shows, it can be really hard to get at. People like to box you. So that is one thing that they're very good at, is actually seeing someone's potential and then giving them the chance to play that role. And that's also, I think, why they've been very good at offering people residence. If they can see that they have the skills, they're a great dance captain, they are very good at that.
Yeah, and I suppose in a way as well, thinking about what we were talking about with creatives, that sometimes, particularly people from Asian ethnicities or Black ethnicities or mixed race ethnicities, don't necessarily get those opportunities because there's always the excuse of, well, you haven't had any experience, which is, of course, one of the stupidest ways of ever stopping people from getting experience. But that sort of thing. And I think, again, I would encourage my students again to really look into become a geek like me, look into those sort of the names, get those names in your head, follow their work, follow them on Twitter, and support the work that's going on there, because we all have our favorite musicals. We happen to have landed on one of mine tonight, so we'll move away. We'll move on to talk a little bit about Bend It Like Beckham, which I saw quite a long time. It would have been a long time ago because it was on quite a long time ago. But that was another really interesting adaptation from, I think it was a film originally, wasn't it? There wasn't
No.
So how did you find that? So a film that you'd watched, because you said you watched it that was the one you watched as a family, wasn't it?
Oh yeah, it was an iconic film for me growing up. So I think when I booked that, it was amazing. And also, for my family, it's something that, if I was in Les Mis, I don't, my family aren't that interested in it. However, booking something like Bend It, it's something that they have a link to. So it was really wonderful in that sense as well. And to be in the original cast of something was also really wonderful. It's a really creative process. I think we had around 7 weeks of rehearsals, which is very unusual. So it was just a really, really, really creative show. But actually, even, if I think about now, if something like Bend It was being put on now, I think there would be certain things that would be done very, very differently. If I think back to my auditions, and if I look at the creative team and the production team, there was only one person of South Asian heritage, and that was Gurinder.
Yeah.
And I think when you're telling a British Asian story, that number needs to be higher. So actually, that actually shows the progress that's happened in the past 6 years. We had a cast of about 30 something. It was a large cast. We had no South Asian swings. Wow. So that meant that when it was a severely cut show, you then got people who are not of the right ethnic background playing certain characters. Again, I don't think that would fly now.
No.
So it was a really wonderful experience, but actually it's only now that I look back and think, gosh, we have made some movement, because that wasn't okay. And I think we'd feel more confident we knew it wasn't okay at the time, but I think the difference now is I don't feel like I'm being a problem by saying this isn't right. Whereas back then it just wasn't in the culture or the energy to say something like that.
Yeah, and I think that's it. And I think that's this idea of, and again, a lot of us who are in the room tonight, we come from, various places where we may have lived experience of what people would term as a minority, although that word's a little bit misleading. But we have that different experience, and we quite often feel like if we're complaining about something that we are the problem, and that's not the case at all. And I think, and that goes for within a university setting as well. I think it's really important that if you see something and it doesn't feel right the way we're teaching or anything, always please feel happy to speak out about it, particularly if you can find people you can, you know, because that's the way that we change. That's the way we change.
I think sometimes in creative fields, it can be, I feel like when you work in an office, you know that what am I trying to say? What the chain of command is and what the steps are. If you've got a complaint, if you're having a problem in the office, if you think you're being bullied, if you're unhappy about something, I don't know, you go to your line manager or you go to HR, or there's, whether or not you're heard is a different question, but I feel like there is a clearer way of doing things. In creative fields, and certainly in performance spaces, lines are blurred anyway between roles and management, and so sometimes it's a bit like, who should I be speaking to? Is this a formal conversation or is it not? You know, do I go through my agent? Do I go to my company manager? Do I go to straight to the producers? Do I just sort this out with the actors? Like, you know, what's the etiquette? And I think that's something else that needs to get better in the industry.
Absolutely, and it's, I mean, Bend It Like Beckham is so interesting as well, because I think if I'm right, the story that happened there was they had somebody that was composing and doing the lyrics, and they got replaced at some stage during the process.
Right.
And from my perspective, I felt like I could probably guess which stuff had been written beforehand and which stuff had been worked on by the new creative team. And it was a really, I mean, it was a really lovely musical. It was really fun to watch, and you know, and did so many really great things. I particularly remember, I think, was it a prayer scene, or there was a lovely scene which was very choral,
yes,
very beautiful, and that's the bit that stuck with me all the way through afterwards.
Yeah.
Did you have any particular favourite scenes? I'm answering another question here. Did you have any particular favourite scenes in Bend It Like Beckham, or moments? Because you were ensemble and then Understudy,
Yeah.
Pinky, weren't you?
But yeah, I think again, Pinky stuff was kind of like grey. Although she wasn't as immediately likable, all her stuff was really fun. So yeah, I enjoyed a lot of her stuff. I enjoyed, you know, all the scenes that she kind of had with her sister, which were up in the bedroom. I kind of enjoyed that, because you know, there were two girls from the same background, from the same family, but they had such different attitudes.
Yes.
About life and work and marriage. So I enjoyed kind of having that with Natalie, who played Jess. And I just really loved the whole wedding sequence when I went on as Pinky, because I'm not a dancer. Like, I don't have two left feet, but I'm not a dancer. But to kind of lead a big kind of celebration like that, and kind of wear the traditional clothes and it be so fun and celebratory, I really enjoyed that and it was like a 20-minute number. So I think they were my favorites.
Yeah, that's lovely. It's, you know, I think it's really great to have those sort of really important moments. And one of the things that I'm most interested in, and my students will probably again already realize this, but those moments where different people can see themselves, and it feels like there are moments almost just for you. And I think sometimes in musical theatre, because of the way it's written, we don't find those moments enough. It's far more, let's try and be universal, but universal doesn't really mean universal. It means, you know, let's cater for the majority of the audience who are white, or whatever that might be, or who are straight, or however that might work. And that's one of the things that both of those musicals did so beautifully. Yeah, is having those moments.
But I still think Bend It could have been better at that had there been more people of the right background on the creative team and on the production team.
Yes.
Because I think certain jokes and certain moments were taken out because they weren't landing in the rehearsal room. Well, it doesn't matter if they don't land to you, because that's the story and that's the culture that we're representing.
Yes, absolutely. And maybe they would be things that would also be more contagious within the audience as well.
Yes. And also it's about educating and storytelling. So, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, one of the reasons why with this module we are looking at so many different types of representation is partly because I want to make sure that everyone in this room sees themselves at some stage during this module, but also so that we get used to understanding different points of view and different perspectives for when we're in the position of writing or producing or acting or storytelling or whatever that might be. That's great. You mentioned about dance just now. Is there anything, have you found that coming from a a less of a dance background has been difficult?
Not for me, because the type of roles, I'm ultimately an actress.
Yeah.
So, and the type of roles and the type of shows I want to do don't require me to be a good dancer. And actually something I've ultimately not had to struggle with is if I was a dancer, I think I would struggle more in being boxed into being ensemble. Because often in ensemble tracks, you need to be able to dance to a certain level.
Yeah.
And for me, that's not where my skills lie. I don't want to be an ensemble member. I'm an actress. I want lines.
Yes.
So I think it's, for me, no, it hasn't hindered me because I don't have an interest in doing a dancey show. However, if they're the kind of roles you want to play, then it really does help. Or if you're happy, I've got many friends who are happy to being in the show and doing their ensemble track and dancing and singing, and that's wonderful. But that's not for me.
Yes, and I think actually that's something that we don't emphasize enough sometimes in training, that there are different. Even within being on stage, there are different sort of roles that you might want to think about where your skills apply to those roles.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah, thank you very much for that. What else have we got here? Oh yes, okay, this is an interesting one. I don't know whether this is something that you will have noticed. I hope this is something that is less prevalent with the shows you've worked on, but have you or co-workers ever been subject to the abuse of lately online, where cast members are off on holiday or sick, and some fans get angry and mean about not seeing the exact cast they hoped for? Is that something that you've noticed much?
Not me personally, but yeah, I mean, I've seen it. Some of my friends are experiencing that at the minute, and it's terrible. But I think it's really difficult because in certain shows and certain producers actively promote, which I get because they want to sell their show, certain actors that they've hired, especially if they are people of a name.
Yes. And
I get that. But when you then only promote that person, you are then promoting people being disappointed. Whereas a show like Six, for example, I think are really wonderful at promoting their alternates and all the girls. So and also they have a schedule where you don't know who's going to be on.
Yes.
They decide their schedule at only 2 or 3 weeks in advance. So actually what they've done, I think, is really smart. Because then people aren't disappointed. And it used to be a thing of, things have changed a bit, but it used to be a thing. I remember when I used to go to the theatre that you would know when certain understudies are on, because it would either be on the website and it would be announced. And again, this isn't every producer, but some producers don't actually allow you as the lead to say, I'm going to be off on these days. You're not allowed to announce when you're not going to be performing. And again, that's only promoting disappointment.
Yes.
I think it comes from the top. I think if they celebrated understudies more and actually used it as a marketing tool, they would only actually help them.
Absolutely.
And in turn, I think audiences will get on board then. It's hard with something like Twitter. You're always going to have a few people who are going to be disappointed and nasty and air it on Twitter. Luckily, I think when I was starting out, Twitter was around, but it wasn't as toxic as it is now. So I think it's a really difficult thing, but I do think producers can be doing more to try and take the heat off by doing those things I just said. Yeah.
And it's, I mean, particularly thinking about something like Jamie. So with that particular show, it's probably most likely, if people are coming to see somebody specific, it would probably be either if for somebody like Leighton Williams playing Jamie, or with the character of Hugo or Miss Hedge, which have occasionally been cast, I guess. But certainly that there have been bigger names that have played those roles that people might be familiar with before they come to the theatre.
But I think again, Jamie are good at that. They don't restrict anyone. Leighton is always putting it on what Daisy's not doing. It's actually on the website. So I actually think they are doing all the right things. And also, actually neither Leighton or Noah, who I recently did it with, had an alternate, but when John, who originated it, he eventually got an alternate. I think having an alternate is an amazing thing, because doing 8 shows a week is hard enough as it is. And I think by giving somebody else a designated 1 or 2 or even 3 shows a week, you've already got that balance. And I think people forget. The audiences and your public just sometimes forget. People get sick.
Yeah,
it is like we have a job. We get 25 days or whatever it is sick pay. We are allowed to go off. And I think it's just that we just need to change the culture of talking about it more. Yes. And I think that's where shows go wrong, in terms of you promote the show, not the actor.
Yes. Yeah.
It's the actor's job to promote the actor, not the producers. Don't put the pressure on the actor.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's also, it would be really sad if people didn't see, people like Adam Taylor or Jordan Lavigne, or some of the Gillian Ford, some of the really wonderful understudies. And also, for actors as well, there's something really beautiful about seeing an understudy, because it changes slightly the way, and I can only say this from somebody that watches shows multiple times, but it slightly changes the show when, if I'm seeing Sejal with Mel, is different to seeing Sejal with Gillian, for example.
Yes, completely. And look, I do get it. I've been to see shows in New York and stuff where I was, I went to see King and I, and I was like, well, I'm excited to see Kelly O'Hara. Or I went to see Moulin Rouge, and I was excited to see Karen Olivo. And both times I saw those shows, neither of those ladies were on. Yeah. And there is a part that you go, oh, I would have loved to see her because she won the Tony, or, she's a legend. But then actually, when you sit down and you watch the show, you're seeing somebody else who is trained in what they do and is fantastic. And also, probably in a few years' time, they're going to be the next household name.
Yes.
What I'm not doing is then going to tweet that person saying, how dare you be off?
Yeah, it's a bit like,
mad. It is mad.
Yeah. I mean, I don't usually get tweets when I'm off sick. How dare you not be teaching my class today?
Yeah.
Where was your understudy? But yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for that, because I think that really helps with that sort of discussion there. I've got one more question in the Q&A, and I've also kept the one about the favourite line in Jamie, although I think we sort of half answered that. But this question is: if you could play any character without being restricted by age, race, gender, size, basically anything, what character would you choose?
Oh my God, so many. I really want to play Angelica in Hamilton, but actually, my favourite character in the show is Burr. So I would love to play Burr. I think he's such an interesting person. He's got the best songs.
Yeah. His
through line is epic. So yeah, Burr, I think. I would love to be... Do you know what? It's really hard, because I think actually now, 10 years ago, I would have been able to answer this question like that and just bat off all the parts I want to play, or the parts that I love. But I think ultimately the dream now is to create a part and put my stamp on it. I think that ultimately that's what I would want. And actually maybe playing a character like Jamie.
Yes. Yeah. And it's really interesting as well, is that I only thought this, as people may know if they happen to see my Twitter, I have seen Jamie rather a lot of times. But one of the things that really occurred to me in the last time I watched it was how much I would love to have seen Everybody's Talking About Pretty as a musical. Yes. And how there are so many stories, and I'm so glad that the story of Jamie is out there. I mean, for me personally, as somebody that grew up as a gay man, and and although those sort of things, it really resonates with me. But it also starts to make me think, well, hold on, what are these other stories that could be told that would be so exciting and so lovely, but are not being told? And I suppose it goes back to that idea of the writers again that you were talking about earlier.
Yeah, I think, a lot comes down to writing. And then the next step for me is, I was having this conversation the other day, I think certainly musical theatre particularly, I can only think of one time, and that's for Bend It Like Beckham, where I've auditioned for a musical and there's been an ethnic person on the panel in 10 years. I think casting teams need to be more representative of the shows they are casting.
Yes.
Because, you know, there's so many. Actually, what I think one of the toughest things that I come across, and hopefully this will change over time, is the musical theatre industry doesn't know where to put you if you're not black or you're white.
Mm.
And I think every other, you know, shade of brown that's in between gets lost.
Mm.
Even when I was at drama school, it was, oh, you're the ethnic one, so you sing this song, you can sing this song from this show. It was, you know, Dreamgirls, Sister Act, Lion King, and these are all stuff, this is all stuff that I loved growing up and I loved singing it. But when I entered the industry, I was like, why have I sung a song from The Colour Purple at my end of year showcase?
Mm.
I'm never going to be in a show like The Colour Purple, because that is ethnically specific show.
Yes.
As is Dreamgirls, as is Motown. But that is the box I would get put in because I was ethnic. And I think the musical theatre industry has a long way to go. Instead of putting me in the bracket of an ethnicity I can't play, there are a plethora of other roles that I could play that I just don't get seen for, because typically they have always been cast white.
Yes.
I don't know how I got into this point. I can't remember what your original question was, but I think that is something that needs to get better. And that will only happen when we see more diversity in terms of, you know, I need to see people who look like me. I need to see their faces on posters and their names in lights. And actually, the interesting thing was when Hamilton first got announced that it was coming over, and I auditioned, my first ever audition for it. I remember having a chat with the casting team, and they were saying they really want the casting over here to represent the UK. Right. Yeah. Because what it does in the States is it represents diversity in the States.
Yes.
And I completely got, for what I took from that is, yes, you wanted to represent the UK. In the UK, the largest ethnic minority group is the South Asian community. I believe it's 7 or 8% of the UK, double any other ethnicity. That is not reflected in the casting of musical theatre. No. Even now, Hamilton's been on how many years here now? 4 years, 3 years, 4 years?
4, I think, yeah.
4. They have never had a single South Asian actor in that show. That is not representative of London or the UK. So I think that's where they're going wrong with South Asian representation. Just having a few Black people in your show doesn't mean that you're representing the Black community or any other of the global majority.
Yes, absolutely. And one of the things we're trying to move away from here is using the term BAME, because it's the Black and Asian minority ethnicity, because that is the thing that makes this into the thing that we've talked a lot about in this module about binaries, and how nearly every binary is false. It's not you can be white or you can be Black, or you can be white or you can be non-white, you know, in the same way it's not you can be straight or you can be gay or whatever it may be.
And it's really hard to get it right, and we always have to get it wrong in order to have the conversations to get it right. But I also feel like, you know, 5-6 years ago it would have been, you know, for me, oh yes, you're brown, so you can play an Arabic role, you can play a Hispanic role. And in many ways I was like, yes, I can be in West Side Story. And there's a part of me that's like, you know, if it's a concert version, why can't I be Anita? But in the same breath, I also, and I am not Hispanic, and I would completely understand if a Hispanic person would be upset at me playing a Hispanic role. So it's you know, it's finding the balance is hard, and it's hard to get it right, but you have to still try. You know, I used to have the conversation all the time of, you know, I still get put up in TV as well for Arabic roles or North African roles, or because the lines can be a bit blurred.
Yeah.
Is it okay or not? I don't know, but these conversations need to be happening.
Yeah, I wonder as well about whether the thing is that there's such a limited number of roles for anybody that is, you know, that is Asian or North African or or whatever that might be, or Hispanic, or whatever that might be. Whereas actually perhaps where we should be looking is thinking all these roles that we are assuming are white do not need to be white. That's where, you know, there's a really, really big problem, I think, because we just make this assumption. I remember when I was pitching a musical, and I remember I had a family that I'd written and I needed to show them. So I put them on the PowerPoint, and I thought, I'm not going to put them on the PowerPoint as white. I'm going to put them on the PowerPoint as black and see what happens. And then what happened is that everyone assumed that I was writing a musical about a black family, which I wasn't necessarily. And but it is that thing about, you have to disrupt the idea that anyone that's not given any label of ethnicity is automatically white.
Yes, because also the lines are getting blurred now because there are so many people of mixed heritage as well. Yes. So it's, you know, they're not ethnic enough for something, but then they're not white enough for something else.
Yes.
And, you know, as humanity evolves, we will, you know, we are going to be 50 shades of brown. So you can't, it's really difficult. And it's really difficult to get right. But you have to try. We have to try. And I think casting directors, it starts from the writing, and then the next stage, the writing has to be there.
Yeah.
And then the next stage now is, I just think there needs to be a rehaul. There need to be new, fresh faces in casting offices, in casting rooms, and on production teams. It's a bit harder on production teams because I guess that's the money. But the people that can't, I think casting is a place where I don't see why they can't have a more open office with who they, you know, if I'm auditioning for Hamilton, I don't want to be going to an all white casting team, all white, all male casting team. And actually I shouldn't be having that anymore for anything. No.
And I think these are all things, it does sometimes feel like we sit here and we think, well, what can we do about it? But actually we and you are the people that will be, well, at whatever level, will be deciding these things in the future. And I think it's really important for us to kind of have these in our heads, whatever job we go into, whatever, you know, whether we're in the industry, whether we're working outside of the industry, these are really important things for us to keep remembering. We're pretty much at the end now, so I'm just going to see whether you've come back with a line from Jamie that is your favorite, or whether we need to skip that question.
Do you know what, there are so many. I think they're all, often it's with Ray, it was just the lines that out of context don't make much sense. But even in that first scene where I would, you know, rip up the printout that Jamie had about being a forklift truck driver, and I chuck it in the bin, and then I just go back in the bin and say, fuck off. You know, I just loved her brashness, and I always got a good audience reaction like that. So I think for me, it's all her little throwaway lines like that. And the same again in the office scene. You know, when we go to have this meeting with Ms. Hedge, and Ray's very passive in that scene. She only says two things, or two or three things. She's all swearing, but at the end she just says, boils my piss.
And
I just love that, because I was like, it's just so northern. It's just so Ray. And I just think it's just so relatable.
Absolutely. I think that's my favorite Ray line as well. I think the idea of having somebody that stands up for Jamie in that way, who's not necessarily his, you know, his biological family, but there's something really, I love Ray, and I love your portrayal of Ray as well.
Do you know what? There's one line. Nobody ever knows the words for Limited Edition, which was the song I sang in the show, because it's so wordy. But actually, there's a really, really lovely line in it, which was Ray's line, which is worshipping the bodice of a goddess made flesh. And I just think that's such a good lyric by the genius that is Tom McRae. In context of talking about drag queens, but just talking about humans, and just celebrating femininity, worshipping the bodice of a goddess made flesh. I would really like that line.
It's beautiful. It's lovely. Thank you so much, Sejal. It's been so lovely to talk to you this evening.
Oh, you're most welcome. Thank you for having me.
And thank you to everyone as well who's come along, asked questions and watched and everything. Next week we have Dr. Colleen Ruar coming to talk to us about In the Heights. and Latinx representation in musical theatre. But thank you very much for joining us. Thank you again to Sejal, and have a lovely week, and I'll see you next time.
Bye.
Thanks very much.
You.
Thank you. Bye.